On behalf of PREC and PADC, we would like to welcome you to Reimagining Public Safety. Can surveillance be a fair and effective tool? Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Fairuz Abdullah, and I am on the Piedmont Racial Equity Campaign's Policing Subcommittee. PREC was PREC was launched in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests with the goal of engaging the Piedmont community in anti-racist work in 4 areas: policing, education, housing, and community and civic leadership. Our co-organizer for this event is the Piedmont Anti-Racism and Diversity Committee, a nonprofit and anti-racism group in Piedmont. PADC works to root out racism and to build a diverse and inclusive community through activism and connection. For the past 20 years, PADC has partnered with the city institutions to act as thought partners on issues of racial equity and equity in general. PADC also advocates on behalf of individuals and families and supports and funds anti-racism education and initiatives by awarding grants to educators and community members who advance this work. Before we get started, we would like to thank our co-sponsor for tonight, the League of Women Voters in Piedmont, for getting the word out for this event and helping to support our amazing turnout. I would also like to thank my policing subcommittee partner, Susie Strebel, who is our resident technology and data privacy guru, and PADC co-president, Sheila Lunig. Their efforts resulted in tonight's incredible lineup. Last but not least, I would like to thank my fellow PREC steering committee members for their support, insight, and unwavering commitment to anti-racist work. This brings me to why we decided to put this panel together. Our world is changing rapidly due to technology. Networking, data, and analytical power are reshaping how we live. Every industry is moving in this direction. This is true of law enforcement and the public safety industry, which we have been quick to adopt new surveillance technologies in the hope of improving public safety. There's a broad and ever-growing range of surveillance technologies on the market, from live feed cameras and ALPRs with image recognition, as we have in Piedmont, to network technologies that can identify people not only by their faces, but also by their voices and how they walk. Technology is never neutral in its creation or its application. As Professor Simone Brown, the author of Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, states, quote, "These things are framed by their histories," end quote. As a result, the economic and social impacts can be unequal and even unjust. PADC and PRAC believe we need to consider the role of surveillance technologies and how we police our community and how Piedmont's approach intersects with our broader local area, as well as with the needs for a just and equitable democracy. As many of you know, Piedmont is a relatively non-diverse and affluent town of over 11,000 people, surrounded by Oakland, which is one of the most economically and socially diverse cities in the country, not to mention 40 times the size of Piedmont. Piedmont's sense of safety is largely understood in its relationship to its surrounding environment. Piedmont's crime rates fluctuate. It's hard to draw conclusions from these changes. While most crimes are nonviolent property crimes, there are violent crimes in Piedmont. There have been terrifying gunpoint home invasions and muggings. Every resident in Piedmont can agree that we all want our families and neighbors to be safe. Piedmont began implementing surveillance technologies to improve public safety in 2013, starting with the purchase of ALPR cameras to cover the numerous entrances to Piedmont, and more recently adding live feed cameras to complement these ALPRs in areas where there is a safety concern. We will hear more about public safety surveillance in Piedmont from Chief Bowers. However, surveillance disproportionately impacts disadvantaged communities, particularly those marginalized because of their race, religion, socioeconomic, and/or immigration status. We'll hear more about these disproportionate impacts from our panelists. It's important that the movement to improve racial justice and equity in this country connects with the growing national conversation around surveillance and public safety, and for groups like PADC and PREC to work on these issues together within our community. Before I introduce our speakers, we would like to honor the month of Martin Luther King's birth by reading the words of John Lewis from his book, Across That Bridge, Life Lessons and a Vision for Change. Take a long, hard look down the road you will have to travel once you have made a commitment to work for change. Know that this transformation will not happen right away. Change often takes time. It rarely happens all at once. In the movement, we didn't know how history would play itself out. We were getting arrested and waiting in jail or standing in unmovable lines on the courthouse steps. We didn't know what would happen, but we knew it had to happen. I would like to now introduce our moderator for the evening, Sheila Lunig, who will introduce our panelists. Sheila is not only the co-president of PADC, but also the general counsel for the Partnership on AI, a nonprofit organization focused on responsible design and deployment of artificial intelligence technologies.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce you to the speakers that we have gathered here this evening. Matthew Guareglia is a policy analyst at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He works on surveillance issues at the local, state, and federal level. Matt received his PhD in history, and his research is focused on the intersection of race, immigration, US imperialism, and policing in New York City. His writing has appeared in Slate, Motherboard, and the Washington Post, and he's a visiting scholar in the history department at UC Berkeley. He is also the editor of Disciplining the City, which is a series that can be found on the Metropole blog of the history of urban policing and incarceration. Welcome, Matthew. We also have with us this evening Chief Jeremy Bowers, who is our Chief of Police in Piedmont. He joined the Piedmont Police Department in 2016 and has been engaging community groups and Piedmont residents on issues involving policing in the community ever since. Prior to joining the Piedmont Police Department, he spent 16 years with the San Jose Police Department. He served as a lieutenant in the training division, and before that, as a lieutenant with the Bureau of Field Operations. He holds a BS in Administration of Justice and a master's in Criminology, Law, and Society. Thank you for joining us tonight, Chief Bowers. We also have here with us tonight Jennifer Jones, who is a Technology and Civil Liberties Fellow with the ACLU of Northern California, where she defends and promotes civil rights and civil liberties in the digital age with a focus on the intersection of government surveillance, immigrants' rights, and racial justice. She's a graduate of the UCLA's School of Law, where she specialized in critical race studies and completed the David J. Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy. So thank you for joining us tonight, Jennifer. And we also have Brian Hofer. Brian is the Executive Director of Secure Justice and the Chair of the City of Oakland's Privacy Advisory Commission. Previously, in 2014, he was appointed by the Oakland City Council to chair the Domain Awareness Center, their privacy committee, to develop privacy policies within the city to curtail surveillance intended to aggregate data inputs from facial recognition software, license plate readers, and cameras. He's introduced ordinances to implement surveillance reform and worked on state legislation impacting privacy and surveillance. Brian has also consulted with multiple cities across the country regarding citizen oversight, which is really interesting to hear about tonight. Welcome, Brian. So our first speaker, Matthew, I'd like to invite you to, give us an overview of the issues tonight. And maybe if you can, as a part of that, also kind of level set for our audience tonight on the types of technologies that we're going to be referring to.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, everyone, all the organizers and all my fellow panelists for doing this. This is great. I guess I have the unenviable task of kind of giving the general landscape concerning policing, surveillance, racism, and criminalization more broadly, both because I'm a civil rights practitioner, but also a historian who studies this stuff in a kind of longer sense. So the protests we saw this summer and the larger movement for Black Lives that's been happening since 2013 continues to draw our attention to the wider public, to the state of over-policing in Black communities. There's a vicious cycle that occurs in American cities, and it goes a bit like this. It should sound kind of familiar. Police cover every inch of certain neighborhoods. and not others. So the diligent patrols, the visible police presence lead to very naturally more arrests. And these arrests aren't just for robberies and assaults. They're also the exaggerated police presence also leads to arrests for more kind of nonviolent offenses, things like jaywalking, graffiti, and other things that we call quality of life offenses. And these crimes often go totally unnoticed in communities that don't have such an exaggerated police presence. Then these arrests in the already over-policed community become part of the justification for why the department should put more police in these same neighborhoods. And then the same cycle continues. So surveillance plays an important role in this cycle. And I just want to discuss the different types of surveillance that I most deal with every day and the type of role they play in this large cycle of over-policing and criminalization. Surveillance technology is only as unbiased as the society that produces and uses it. Every few months, a tech startup that believes they can trace through somebody's face the likelihood with which they are likely to commit crimes would show you that there is a long-standing history back to the 19th century of trying to predict criminality in people. And now, because of the data that's being used, they try to frame it as unbiased. And what I mean by this is that they will take a huge database of images of quote unquote known criminals. And usually these are made up of mugshots. And they will train either a face recognition algorithm to look at all these mugshots, and they say, okay, look at the common factors. That common factor, that X factor among all of these mugshots must be how we can predict whether or not a person is a criminal. But because we live in the society we do, where people of color and Black communities are over-policed, where they make up a disproportionate amount of arrests, the database of mugshots are going to be skewed toward people of color. And so when you teach an algorithm to try to predict criminality, the factors they're going to look for are the same factors that determine race. So because the criminal justice system itself is biased, the technology that attempts to replicate this system also becomes biased. And this is a larger metaphor for the many types of surveillance that we look at. Someone looking through the other end of a CCTV monitor will undoubtedly project what they believe personally a suspicious person looks like onto whoever they see. And this opens room for technology-aided racial profiling, not just amongst police, but amongst the consumers that deploy this technology every day and who look at various crime-fighting apps. Automated license plate readers are technology that photograph every license plate that come in and out of a community so that police can be alerted if, for instance, a car that is associated with a specific crime rides into the neighborhood. Or if a crime is committed inside of a certain neighborhood, police can then look at which license plates were in the area at the time. And so, you can see why this would be a tool that police would deploy in crime fighting. But many of these companies now are not stopping there. They're rolling out technology like so-called suspicious vehicle detection, which would send automatic alerts to police if, say, a car with chip paint were driving down a public road. Now, I'd venture to guess that a vast majority of people who own old cars or who can't afford to get paint redone, or maybe are driving home from an accident, are not on a crime spree and are not suspicious. But here we have, again, bias against a certain type of people, against a certain type of car, based on class, based on race, that informs who people are projecting are suspicious. And this suspicion has the power to trigger a police interaction for no reason, because you happen to be driving down a public road with a car that an algorithm has predicted is suspicious. And this is how we kind of heap suspicion, and not only suspicion, but police interaction onto certain types of people. Automated license plate readers like face recognition are also not a perfect technology. Sometimes they get things wrong. Like a family recently in Colorado who was pulled from their car at gunpoint because a license plate reader had misidentified their car. Or the at least 3 Black men now, at least documented cases, that were wrongfully arrested after being misidentified by face recognition. And this brings us to another problem with surveillance technology. I've talked to quite a lot of people who have defended the use of this technology, people in law enforcement, politicians, and they've said over the years, and I hope this is true, I'm sure it's true in most places, that this technology is used just as a jumping off point. It's an investigatory lead that will maybe garner a suspect, maybe it won't, and you can use that to follow up in an investigation. But the people who were pulled over and pulled out of their car after being misidentified by an automated license plate reader did not get the benefit of supplemental investigation. Likewise, in Detroit, when a man was arrested after being falsely identified by face recognition, if police have done supplemental investigatory work, they would have learned that he was miles and miles away at home. I think it was something like half an hour, 45 minutes away at the time the robbery took place. And again, I trust that a lot of places are using some of this technology responsibly, and are doing the kind of supplemental research that needs to be done. But my fear is that because it's so easy to have an algorithm spit out a name and then to go arrest them, problem solved, that a lot of departments, as we've seen, are using this technology in that irresponsible way. If a crime is committed and police go talk to somebody whose license plate was recorded nearby, they might learn that the car was just passing through or that it's on somebody's usual commute. But you can see how here there's a lot of room also for circumstantial evidence. It's not a crime to aimlessly drive around public streets if you've had a bad day or if you're listening to the radio. But if you drive past a license plate reader and you happen to be in a place near a place where a crime is committed that same day, it could get you into trouble. You could become an inadvertent suspect in that crime. And in this way, the people who live in communities with higher crime rates often suffer both edges of a double-edged sword. They are both more often the victims of crime because they live in high crime neighborhoods, and also they are the most likely to suffer from over-policing and from surveillance. And that's why some of this technology, like face recognition and so-called predictive policing algorithms, are quickly being banned at the state and at the city level. In addition to their flaws, in addition to how police may use it, it generally just erodes the trust between people and government. And I know retaining some of that trust has been a mission of a lot of police departments since the George Floyd protest this summer. It erodes all of the presumption of innocence for an entire city worth of people if every day you are the subject of that suspicion. So let me put this in another way. If you have a driver's license or a passport, there is pretty much a 100% possibility that your picture is one of the many faces in a large facial recognition database, which means that every time state or federal law enforcement have a grainy suspect photo that they want to find, they have to compare it with your face as they run the search through the very large DMV database. So not only does that mean that you're in a constant digital police lineup of sorts, it also increases your chance of potentially being falsely identified as the person in that photo. And this is exactly why cities in the US, from New Orleans all the way up to Maine, Cambridge, Massachusetts, to here in Oakland and San Francisco, why all of these cities have banned the technology. So to put on my historian hat for a second, I have to ask, so why is there so much surveillance? Well, it's because obviously crime is real. It happens and it hurts real people. There are real victims and survivors of crime. Surveillance is historically, and in this moment, has been used to serve two specific functions: to deter crime before it happens, or after crime happens, to assist in solving that crime or using that evidence to get convictions. I'll start by saying that there's not a lot of evidence that surveillance deters crime. People often, as we've seen, commit crimes in places where they know or at least suspect that they might be under surveillance. In my years of both civil liberties and in academia, I have yet to come across really compelling and overriding data that shows that visible surveillance deters people who are motivated to commit crimes. And the second is that even when surveillance can help get convictions, I'm not sure that it helps crime rates per se in a larger sense. This is where I hope that this moment gives us a chance to step back and look from a wider vantage point. convictions have generally little impact on the rise and fall of crime on a national or even a regional scale. One person gets put away, it doesn't make, in general, a city safer. And this moment we're in invites us to take a more holistic approach to thinking about crime. One that centers, as the title of this event challenges us to do, ones that makes us center public safety, and put resources into addressing the root causes of crime, and kind of going against the multi-decade kind of the penchants for austerity, and to use kind of putting money into public resources as a crime fighting measure, rather than put the money and the resources into addressing the symptoms. Surveillance emerged in American society for a specific reason, and that was to some extent to replace a trusting and collaborative public. You don't need a good relationship with members of the community, and you don't have to ask them what they saw if you can go to the camera on the street corner instead. And this is, I think, the wrong approach. There's no substitute for trust and collaboration, transparency, and accountability. Banning the worst surveillance technology, implementing ordinances that give the public the right to have a say in what technology their police use and when they use it. All of this takes steps forward into thinking about public safety in a broader, more holistic way. And these are exactly the type of approaches that the other members of the panel, I'm so grateful for them because they've spent years thinking about how to rebuild this trust and how to think about crime and public safety in a more holistic way, and not in a very kind of punitive way that we've been trying for centuries and have failed to generally address crime because we're still fighting it. And so with that, I will finish my statement and hand it back to the moderator.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was a really great overview of of the issues, and it prompted me to think about what are your thoughts on the long-standing argument that there is actually an inherent trade-off between civil rights and public safety, and then where do surveillance technologies fit?
I think to some extent that's kind of a false dichotomy. I think that public safety operates best when it has buy-in from all members of the community. When members of the community feel confident that the mechanisms of government aren't out to screw them over, aren't like out to end up arresting somebody for unpaid parking tickets if they go to the police because they've been robbed. That policing and public safety works best when there is a collaborative effort. And part of that effort, I think, has to come from putting the resources we generally put into one approach to addressing public safety, which is policing, and put some of those resources into the more long-term projects that address the root causes of crime, things like housing and public health and education and public resources that are also crime-fighting measures, but we have been conditioned over a century to think that whenever there is crime, the only answer for it is to throw police at it. And I think police agree, at least the police I spoke to, that police are called upon in our society today to do far too much. There are way too many tasks of government that, 2 generations ago, that, in the mid-20th century, other aspects of government would have been called to deal with. And so I think getting back to an approach where governance is thought of, like I said, in a more holistic way, and that crime fighting and that public safety is an endeavor for every aspect of government and not just the police, would get us to a place where we don't have to address the kind of dichotomy between, well, we can have public safety or we can have our privacy and civil liberties. I think both go hand in hand when you think about it in a more holistic way. Sorry, I keep saying holistic, but that's
excellent. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that perspective, and thank you again for the overview. I'd like to now invite Jeremy, Chief Bowers, to join us and to maybe kind of bring this broader perspective down to Piedmont. And please, I invite you to speak.
All right. Well, thank you, Sheila. I appreciate it, and it's great to be here tonight. And this is exactly what we're talking about. So the question of the night is: can surveillance be a fair and effective tool? And to me, the answer is yes. But it's yes if we do three things. And this is the philosophy of this police department in the city, from my perspective. The answer is yes if we engage the public in a public process of bringing these technologies on. The answer is yes if we remain transparent as an organization in policing and how we're using this technology. And the answer is yes if we're held accountable to good, strong policy. If we do those things in our application of this type of technology and continue these conversations, because I think they need to continue for the simple fact that this technology changes so rapidly. What we say yes to, 5 years ago is potentially much different than what we're saying yes to now. So I think that's key. What I want to do tonight is take folks through an overview of how we use surveillance technology here in Piedmont. And specifically, I'll talk about our ALPR program, and then I'll touch on the public safety camera program, which is not a fully realized program at this point in time, but we are moving in that direction. So I'm going to jump on a screen share. I promise I'm not going to PowerPoint to death anybody tonight, but I think there's some visuals that folks may find useful, and I don't want to assume a lot of knowledge about what we do and how we do it with respect to that. So I will jump on the screen share. Hopefully I can manipulate this. All right. So if I could get a thumbs up if you see a presentation mode of this diode thing. I'm not a tech person, which is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So through this overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about a few things. Number one, the question why? Why are we looking to utilize this technology? I'll talk a little bit about an overview and talk about some operational aspects of ALPR in Piedmont. I'll touch on transparency, some data considerations, and a few metrics. So the why behind this, quite frankly, it's crime. Back in 2012, we had several home invasion robberies that significantly, put the community in the city in a position of having a global conversation about how it could mitigate some of these crimes from occurring, and also bring something in that could be a force multiplier. At the time, the city and the department, this was very much a public conversation. And it was a conversation that was not one-sided. There were multiple views and viewpoints on this topic. And ultimately, the city council voted to approve a ALPR, automated license plate reader program. But again, there were those folks who absolutely had safety concerns. And so there was debate, but ultimately the decision was made to implement a program. So the program that we have here in Piedmont that was implemented originally was a program that stood up 39 fixed ALPR cameras that covered 15 different intersections throughout the city. Last year, we expanded the program to include to bring in and incorporate 8 additional cameras at 5 additional intersections. The decision to do that was based upon a period of time that we had to understand some of the crime trends and look at some scenarios where basically significant crimes had occurred, home invasion robberies had occurred, and we were able to identify areas of ingress and egress which weren't covered by a public safety camera. But again, we're not talking about just one incident justifying the establishment of a camera, but over the course of a period of time, a significant amount of data and in terms of reported crimes that had been occurring in those different areas, and significant crimes, not insignificant crimes. So that was established just this past year. What you have before you here is a map of the city, and these are the locations of our current ALPR sites. The hexagon, I think that's a hexagon, six sides that you see. The hexagon icons are locations of existing sites. The X's that you see on the screen are locations of the expanded version of the program. So the way we utilize ALPR in Piedmont, and again, it's a little bit nuanced and a little bit different than how some other agencies use it. Yes, it's an investigative tool, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we also use it to proximately affect potential crime in actual crime that is occurring to respond to it immediately. And the way we do that is some folks who may know when a vehicle is either stolen or utilized in a crime and that's verified, that information is input into different criminal databases. One commonly referred to is the stolen vehicle system. And our systems access that system. And so when the ALPR camera spots a plate that's either wanted in a crime or stolen, it instantaneously sends a high alert, which we term a high alert, to two different sources: our dispatcher and our officers on their mobile computers in their vehicles. And the high alert indicates the location of the individual or the individual vehicle in a direction of travel, as well as a snapshot of what the car looks like. So you can see the back half of the vehicle and obtain information like it's a convertible. So that gives the dispatcher an opportunity to give an additional cue to the officers who are responding to the area. One of the key things that the dispatcher does when we get this high alert, and Matthew alluded to it, was we want to verify that that vehicle is actually the vehicle that the system is telling us is stolen or wanted. And so that's immediately what the dispatcher does, is to verify that vehicle. So we run that vehicle in our system to determine, number one, that it's still stolen, to validate that the image that the system captured is in fact the license plate that is coming up in the system as wanted. And that's all done immediately. And that's a critical piece of how our dispatcher plays a role in that. Once that information goes out, that information gets transmitted to our responding officers, and they become, obviously over the course of the years that we've had this program, very adept at going to the locations and looking for the wanted vehicle. And generally what happens in those circumstances are one of basically three things. Basically, when the officers get there to the scene, again, Piedmont's 1.8 square miles. So our officers are able to respond fairly quickly there. Generally, oftentimes, sometimes the vehicle will be gone. It will be out of the city or in another part of the city. And it's not uncommon to have a high alert hit in one part of the city, and then as the car passes to another part, it'll hit on another camera. So it provides the officers a perspective of the direction of travel. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is that the officers get there and they find the vehicle and they initiate a vehicle stop in order to take the person, to detain the person and take them in custody if appropriate. That happens frequently. A third option is that the person takes off, and depending upon the severity of the crime, if it's a car that's associated with a homicide or a violent robbery, we may engage in a pursuit depending upon the circumstances, and because we apply a balancing test. If it's just a stolen vehicle, it's a property crime, we're not going to pursue that vehicle. We have a restrictive pursuit policy, and we're not going to pursue them. But if that person takes off and they're out of our city, quite frankly, I count that as a win. Realistically, in the reality that we experience, frequently people are using stolen vehicles to commit other types of crimes. And so when they're coming into town and we spot them and they take off and we don't pursue, again, in my mind and our experience, we're counting that as a win, because potentially that's somebody that was going to be a victim, and now they're not in our community anymore. We do ensure that we notify our Oakland colleagues of the occurrence and the location and the last direction of travel, because we want them to be aware as well. So our dispatch as a procedure, as a routine procedure, we'll contact Oakland's dispatch to let them know we had a stolen vehicle flee from us or a wanted vehicle flee from us in a direction of travel. So as I mentioned, it's also an investigative tool, and we have found success in numerous investigations particularly with some of our robberies in utilizing ALPR technology, and most frequently or recently, I'm sorry, with integrating that with our public safety camera. And we have a pilot that I'll talk a little bit about. This is just an example of some type of robbery a couple years ago that folks moved in. There was a home invasion within 3 weeks of them moving in. Very traumatic for the couple and their guests. But we were able to utilize the ALPRs to identify a vehicle that we spotted during a canvass, and during that, that enabled us to employ other investigative techniques to identify the suspects and ultimately take them into custody. And again, prevent them from victimizing other people. The reality of a lot of criminal enterprises is that it's not just a first time they're going to victimize one person and then stop. They're frequently continuing to victimize folks, and so that was ultimately 3 individuals were taken into custody and held accountable. So again, this is just one example of how we use it as an investigative tool. Transparency is huge. As I talk about, I think we get to a yes when we're transparent. One of the things here in Piedmont that we do with our ALPRs is in our data is I'm accountable. Our department's accountable and our city's accountable to the public for the investment and the trust that they've put into us by allowing us to use this technology. So on a quarterly basis, I go before the city council and I give a report out on a number of different things. But one of those things is to talk about our statistics and rates of hit rates and whatnot on our ALPRs. And so this is just a little snapshot of what we provide. Coincidentally, on February 1st, I'll be giving our year-end report. And so I'll have quite a bit to talk about with respect to our ALPRs to our city council. But this is something that we're passionate about here, that we do, because again, it offers us an opportunity to continue this dialogue during city council meetings on a quarterly basis, so the public can check in, see what we're doing, how we're utilizing it. And again, because this technology is not cheap, so what's the return on the investment, and how are we utilizing it? The data is important, and how the data is kept and the security of the data is huge. So, bottom line is we have a 1-year retention. We have a 1-year retention for our ALPR data. We house our data at the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, otherwise known as the NCRIC. And housing it there was the decision that was made for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it's a government entity, and a government entity that provides the storage capacity that was cost effective for the city, but also provides safety considerations and security considerations to a standard that the city could have confidence in. So I don't want to get too technical with the security measures and all that kind of good stuff and the encryption rates and whatnot, but it does provide that component to us. In terms of access, the access to it is basically we own that data. It is our data, and we determine who can have access to it and who can't. SB 54 relates to the California Values Act. And so that was passed just now, 2 years ago now. And basically after the passage of SB 54, it became law. And it was law before that. We did not, or it was our practice before that, we did not utilize our ALPR data for immigration enforcement. But that passage of SB 54 put additional restraints. And so that is something that we guard with absolute certainty that that data is not going to be used for immigration enforcement. Now, in terms of the value of having our data accessible for our law enforcement partners, we see that as something that is important because we know the reality of folks who are engaged in criminal activity, in routine criminal activity. They don't relegate their activity to one city. They don't just stay within the bounds of the borders of one city. So they travel throughout, and the ability for our partners in our region to access data when they're conducting an investigation, benefits the region and is, again, a force multiplier for the region in terms of public safety. In terms of security, I talked about that a little bit in terms of physical security that exists and whatnot. One of the other things I want to talk about with the data, though, is also policy and the fact that internally with auditing ability, we have policy that requires auditing. And the bottom line is that our folks need to adhere to the policy, because if they don't, they're subject to discipline up to and including being terminated from employment. So finally, some metrics. This is for the life of the program that we've had in Piedmont. We've arrested over 150 suspects directly related to the ALPR high alerts. These for a variety of crimes. Generally, it's for possession of stolen vehicles and different paraphernalia, weapons they may have in the car, narcotics they may have in the car, in addition to being in possession of a stolen vehicle. Or just involved in other crimes such as robberies, and the car was associated with the robbery, and taking them into custody for that. And these are folks and that does not include folks who we've located in investigations subsequent. So this is not including arrests where basically because of utilization from an investigatory standpoint, we've taken folks into custody. So for instance, the slide I had up with the home invasion robbery, where we were able to identify and hold accountable those 3 individuals. That doesn't include those types of situations and scenarios. It's provided leads in hundreds of cases. We've covered quite a number of stolen vehicles, getting them back to the owners. It's funny. It was not funny, but it's a coincidence. Just last week, I was coming out of a local store and saw a gentleman. He flagged me down and asked if where the police department was, and so I walked him over to where our department was, and he was here because we had recovered his stolen vehicle, and so he's very appreciative of that. We got him his vehicle back, and we had a conversation about the fact of how we recovered it, and he was quite happy about it. So it's not just it's not just our internally our folks that we can positively impact, but the region. And that averages 7,400 plates, hit plates annually. That's since it's about 2014. And again, that's not reads. It's distinct from license plate reads, which is substantially more than that. But those are just hits that we have during the course of that period of time. The ALPR incidents that you see here, these are those, as I described earlier, when a vehicle comes into our town and we confirm that it's wanted, and officers respond to locate the vehicle. That's what this measure right here is showing you. So these for the last 3 years, 172 incidents up to 324 in 2019, and then down to 305 in 220. That's officers going to a location and doing one of those 3 things that I talked about earlier: finding them, not finding them, and taking them into custody. So that concludes that piece. If I have a couple more minutes, I can talk a little bit about public safety cameras, but
you know what, maybe we'll come back to that during the moderated session, but I mean, this is excellent. I know there's just so many Piedmont residents on the call who are probably learning this information for the first time. So yeah, it was a really great overview and getting really specific on, what technologies we're using and how they're being used. And then that accountability, piece, like what are the metrics on it? So I guess then, so thank you very much, Chief Bowers. And we'll definitely circle back to talk about, more specific issues with respect to Piedmont. What I want to do now is invite Jennifer to talk about, having listened to Jeremy and Matthew, we're all here tonight. One of the goals is to look at these issues through a racial equity lens, and I invite you to, speak about the issues from that perspective. In particular, what concerns do we need to have with the impact that these technologies have on Black and Brown people in our community to live here, work here, visit here.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to everyone in attendance tonight for joining us. If we could pull up the slides to get started, that would be great. Perfect, thank you so much. So at the ACLU of Northern California, our Technology and Civil Liberties project was established in the early 2000s in the aftermath of 9/11, which of course was a paradigm shifting moment for Americans in many respects, but in particular with respect to surveillance and the eroding of our privacy rights, ostensibly to protect our country and prevent further acts of terrorism. What we witnessed in the years following 9/11 was the perpetuation of this narrative that dragnet surveillance of people nationwide was sort of a necessary evil to prevent another similar horrific event from happening again. And in times of crises, we know that people understandably panic, right? They want to feel safe, they want to feel secure, and that desire to feel some level of security tends to lower the resistance we might otherwise have to any infringement on our civil rights and civil liberties. And that is essentially what we saw happen in the post-9/11 landscape with the passage of the Patriot Act, followed by the increased funding for surveillance and other investigative tools from federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security that was and continues to be funneled to state and local law enforcement entities to combat terrorism. So against that backdrop, we started to see a significant shift in approaches to policing that really sort of focused on a predictive framework that included a monitoring of and watching folks closely in hopes that crime could be prevented before it occurred. So this shift that we saw happening almost 2 decades ago is really what catalyzed the ACLU's work in this area to fight back against increased surveillance and the erosion of individual rights to privacy. But central to our work is not just this notion that privacy is a civil liberty that must be protected, which of course it is, but also the reality that surveillance and the erosion of privacy are threats that we know disparately impact marginalized communities and communities of color, and at worst sort of directly, intentionally target them. And I'll explain with more specificity what I mean by that and why we approach anti-surveillance work as a racial justice issue at ACLU. So perhaps the best way to start is to ground us in some historical context that really informs how we approach our surveillance work today. We know that surveillance of Black people and other people of color does have a pernicious and honestly really largely unaddressed history that goes all the way back to the antebellum era. One example that you see increasingly being discussed is 18th century lantern laws, which were laws in New York City that actually required Black, mixed race, and indigenous enslaved people to carry candle lanterns with them if they walked around the city after sunset and were not in the company of a white person. And the law prescribed various punishments for those that didn't carry this supervisory device, which of course was meant to track the whereabouts of Black and indigenous people, and in doing so, deter individuals from trying to escape to their freedom or organize themselves to fight back against their inhumane living conditions and captivity. Next slide, please. So this sort of suspicion and perception that Black and indigenous people of color inherently pose a threat to society, especially if they are challenging the status quo or social order, really carried over into subsequent historical periods of anti-racist activism, including the moment that we find ourselves in today. So in the 1960s, we know that the FBI had a surveillance program known as the Counterintelligence Program, often referred to as COINTELPRO, which was the series of covert and often illegal activity that the FBI engaged in. They conducted surveillance infiltration, discreditation, and the disruption of domestic political organizations. And some of their actions actually led to murder. And their targets were the Black Panther Party, Martin Luther King Jr., women's liberation leaders, and the American Indian movement. And today, in the era of Black Lives Matter, we're sort of seeing a continuation of this historical pattern where protesters and movement leaders and organizers find themselves also being closely watched by local and federal law enforcement. And what's particularly scary about this modern day surveillance of activism is that there are so much more sophisticated technology tools that Matthew described earlier that sort of make this spying so much easier and efficient. And I can give you some examples. Next slide, please. So back in 2016, the ACLU uncovered the use of social media surveillance by law enforcement agencies in Northern California and found some exchanges between officers indicating that they specifically scrutinized the social media accounts where particular words or hashtags associated with the movement, words like Black Lives Matter or no justice, no peace, were targeted. And that's obviously very scary for people who engage in their First Amendment right to protest and assemble, because it means that their identities are easily traceable. And social media, which provides the platform for groups to sort of stay connected and stay organized, has sort of been repurposed as a surveillance mechanism. Next slide. We saw that a similar technology was also used to monitor the unrest that occurred in Baltimore after Freddie Gray was killed in 2015, in addition to the deployment of facial recognition technology to identify and locate protesters during those protests. Next slide. And then finally, a very recent example is actually the subject of a suit that we're currently litigating. If we can move to the next slide, please. In late May and early June 2020, during mass demonstrations of the George Floyd protests, we found that the San Francisco Police Department, in defiance of a 2019 city ordinance backed by the ACLU and other civil rights organizations, had illegally tapped into a sprawling private camera network to conduct live mass surveillance of protesters. And SFPD did so without first going through a legally required public process and obtaining permission from the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And records that were obtained and released by the Electronic Frontier Foundation in July of last year show that SFPD received a real-time remote link to more than 400 surveillance cameras in San Francisco. And this vast camera network is operated by the Union Square Business Improvement District, which is a non-city entity. So this was really scary just because these network cameras are high definition. They allow for remote zoom and focus capabilities, and they're linked to a software system that can automatically analyze content, including distinguishing between when a car or a person passes within the frame. So in response to this surveillance, EFF and the ACLU actually sued San Francisco over the city police department's illegal use of the camera network. And that case is still currently pending. Next slide, please. So as I've described, there is this very long history of surveillance being deployed specifically to target communities of color as they engage in anti-racist activism. But I do want to be very clear that surveillance technology, of course, it doesn't pose a threat to people only who protest or are organizing. It also poses very serious threats to the safety of people of color as they go about their daily lives and routines. As Matthew alluded to earlier, in the news lately, there have been increasing reports of false arrests that have occurred due to police reliance on facial recognition technology to identify suspects. One example is last year, the New York Times reported the story of Robert Williams, a Black man who was wrongfully arrested in Detroit on a larceny charge. And the police in that instance had run surveillance footage in a store through a facial recognition database. And the technology erroneously matched Mr. Williams' face with the face of a suspect. And that led to his arrest. This was a man with a family, no criminal history, who had to endure this traumatic event at the hands of surveillance technology. Similarly, in New Jersey, it was recently reported that Niger Parks, another Black man, was falsely identified by facial recognition software and arrested for shoplifting and trying to run over an officer with a car. Even though he was in a completely different part of the city at the time those crimes were committed. So again, you see someone having to endure the trauma of being arrested due to technology that overwhelmingly makes mistakes when it comes to people of color. And the reasons for that are complicated. Part of it is how the algorithms are trained, which of course reflects the bias that could be translated into technology when programmers themselves have racial biases. Another part of it is the fact that, there is this long history of disproportionate arrest and incarceration rates of Black people. So face recognition databases are more likely to have a high number of mugshots of Black people that live there, increasing the risk that there will be false matches against them. Next slide, please. So one last example that I'll share before we talk about possible interventions is a story that many of you might be familiar with because it happened here in the Bay Area, which is the case of Denise Green in San Francisco, who was pulled over by the police and held at gunpoint back in 2014 after an ALPR reader mistook her license plate to be associated with a vehicle that had been used in a crime. So again, just another situation where you see that the mistakes that surveillance technologies can and do make have very serious life-threatening consequences for people of color. And that is why we say that surveillance in the context of public safety can be extremely racist. Next slide, please. So all of this really brings us to the question of how do we adequately address these very pressing problems with racism and surveillance? And unfortunately, there is no easy answer. Surveillance, I know, can be a very touchy subject because proponents want to feel safe and protected from crime. They want to protect their property and their families and strongly believe that surveillance will either deter crime or help catch people who have committed a crime. And I certainly empathize with those sentiments and know that anti-surveillance activists also want to experience that feeling of collective safety. The issue with viewing surveillance as a solution is one, as Matthew mentioned earlier, it doesn't really get at the root causes of crime, which we know are severe income inequality, poverty, homelessness, mental illness, and so forth. And so long as these conditions exist, people will continue to resort to crime, oftentimes to survive. And two, we really don't have much evidence that surveillance works. We do know that surveillance causes a lot of harm. It chills the exercise of First Amendment rights. It may make people reluctant to access critical reproductive health care, for example, out of fear of being identified. And it just creates an overall eerie feeling of constantly being watched that is very unhealthy and doesn't really comport with a free democratic society. And as I've described, puts lives at risk when it makes mistakes. So how to solve these complex social problems is certainly beyond the scope of this conversation, but I do just want to acknowledge the fear and the pain that I know underlies the push to rely on surveillance technology, and make clear that those are considerations that privacy advocates take into account when we do our advocacy. We and many of our partners in the civil rights space have considered all of these things and concluded that the dangers posed by the technology really substantially outweigh any purported benefits that the technology may have. And that is exactly why we fight it. So the ACLU employs an integrated advocacy approach when we address issues of surveillance. So that means that we don't just work in the legislatures or go to the courts, but we define a goal and then sort of choose the tactics and strategies that are best suited to achieving that goal. We also aim to do our work in coalition as much as possible. So we frequently work with a multiracial coalition of immigrants' rights allies, racial justice, economic justice, and LGBTQ rights organizations, who we know are most impacted by government surveillance. Back in 2016, we published a guide that provided for a model ordinance that local municipalities could use to promote transparency, accountability, and oversight when it comes to government use of surveillance technology. And these ordinances require that local governments have some sort of public debate process where the community is informed about the technologies that are being utilized, but also can have a say in whether those technologies should be deployed or what limits or restrictions should be imposed if they are indeed approved for use. So since 2016, we have focused a lot of energy on fighting to ensure that communities and the people impacted by technologies have an opportunity to make the decisions and can simply say no. And as a result of that, we have successfully helped pass surveillance ordinances in 7 Northern California communities, including cities around Piedmont, like Oakland, Berkeley, and San Francisco. And notably, the ordinance in San Francisco also includes an outright ban on facial recognition, which San Francisco residents felt very passionately about, just given everything that we know about that technology's propensity for racial bias. Next slide, please. So one significant development over the last year has been our publication of a toolkit that actually serves as a step-by-step guide for passing a local surveillance ordinance. You can find this guide on our website, and it summarizes many lessons that we've learned over the years about how to work effectively together and fight against local surveillance in various cities. So to the extent that there is interest in Piedmont and being more collaborative with law enforcement and developing a process that centers the voices of community members when determining if, how, and when surveillance tech can be used, I would strongly encourage you all to take a look at this toolkit, use it as a resource and a starting point for that advocacy. From what I can tell, Northern California in many ways has pioneered efforts to combat surveillance and ban particular technologies. And I think that folks in Piedmont are really at an advantage where you're all in a position to sort of build on some of these previous efforts and get a sense from neighboring communities about how they feel surveillance ordinances and other surveillance advocacy have helped or improved the situation in their cities. So I'll wrap up by saying, they often say that technology moves way faster than the law, and that is definitely true. But right now the law is moving pretty fast to get out ahead of these threats that we've discussed today. And we are seeing some really big shifts in public opinion on these issues and an understanding of the relationship between technology and civil rights. So I'm optimistic. I think a lot of us are optimistic and excited to continue the fight with our partners. And certainly are excited to hear that it sounds like Piedmont wants to help join in that fight.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. What you just shared kind of helped me form some answers that I've been thinking about or trying to develop. Like when I speak to, my white friends here in Piedmont, and we hear, what's the big deal? Like, I don't care. These technologies are great. They're going to keep me safe. It helps expand on, it's not just about us, right? It's about how do these technologies affect everyone in the larger community, and then what impact does that have on all of us? So thank you very much for sharing. And so our last speaker, Brian, I think it's great. Now we get to bring it back to the Bay Area again. Between you and Jeremy, and you really have that covered. I'd love to hear about your work in Oakland and other communities, and how we might apply the work that you've done as we, Jeremy has invited community members to kind of engage both through attendance at city council meetings, but also in other ways that we might develop to engage community stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Sheila, and everyone that's invited me to be here. Appreciate it. I think we're running a little bit behind time, so I'm going to do my very best not to duplicate anybody's talking points, but there are some things that I believe were kind of glossed over a little bit that might make it more clear to some of the casual listeners about why we're having this conversation. And I do really appreciate the chief's comments about public engagement. I'm kind of curious if we have time at the end, if he can expand upon that, because in my opinion, in California, we have the Brown Act, you get 72 hours of notice. And typically, most jurisdictions don't have lengthier notices like a sunshine ordinance. We're pretty lucky in the Bay Area. San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley do. But generally, people post an item on a Friday afternoon, they vote on a Tuesday. That's not enough time for the electeds or the public to really have any input to make informed decisions. And there often isn't sufficient information in the staff report. You know, a police officer is not going to think the same way as maybe a privacy activist. And so there's just things that are not addressed. And how I became an activist, as you heard in the intro, was the Domain Awareness Center project in Oakland. That was sprung on the public 2 weeks after Edward Snowden hit the front pages, about half a year after Occupy had ended in Oakland. So there was a lot of just nervous energy going around, a lot of suspicion. And here was this big proposed citywide mass surveillance project. Back then, they were even talking about facial recognition, license plate readers, shot spotters, stingrays, aggregating all this data and sharing it with federal partners. Oakland had zero privacy policies in effect at that time. A $12 million surveillance project, no guardrails at all. And so understandably, the public was frustrated. And this is, you know, one of the questions I would like to hear from the chief later is, you know, public engagement. The whole reason most of us work on this ACLU model ordinance that Jennifer described is because policies are typically unilaterally written. The police put it out there, you know, maybe there's a little public scrutiny, but again, there's not much notice to really have a robust discussion. And those policies are adopted without really getting political buy-in. And I think that's what's made the Oakland model so much different than everyone else, is that we have a privacy commission. It's a little bit more casual than the city council. People are less intimidated. They're able to more freely speak. But we also do a really, really deep dive. Like, we get into the meat of this. We challenge the conclusions. You know, we demand data up front. And that's what these model ordinances require, so that we can make a truly informed decision that's best for the community. I've you know, done this at small cities, big cities, counties. I think it's scalable. It could be done at the state level. We've tried it a couple times in California, unsuccessfully, unfortunately. But as we get more local successes, I think the winds of change are going to impact us at the state level. I want to talk on some of the specifics more on the license plate readers. So what you're not hearing, or what you didn't hear earlier, is that ALPR is indiscriminate mass surveillance. It's not targeted. Okay, these scanners are out there. Everybody that drives by, their data is collected. And that locational data can be very revealing. The data science experts tell us you only need 4 scans, 4 geospatial scans, so that's time and location, to accurately identify over 95% of people. 99.97% of all scans will never be tied to wrongdoing. So almost all the scans are useless from a public safety perspective, okay? In 2017, Piedmont recorded 22 arrests, but that's out of 22 million plate scans. So when the chief is talking about return on investment, these are the things that need to be discussed. You know, what was the cost, both to the taxpayer of the equipment, but also the civil liberties? You know, we've never really had that conversation, certainly not at the national level. You know, do we consent to police tracking us as we move around? Can they collect data on people without like reasonable suspicion or probable cause? We've never really consented to that. I guess you could make an argument, well, ALPR is here and nobody's burning down City Hall, so maybe there's sort of implied consent. But my position is that most people just don't understand this. They don't know how it works. They haven't been informed, so we never really had consent. How it ties into the theme tonight, in 2015, I believe it was, maybe 16, the EFF looked at the Oakland Police Department's license plate data retention and their practices. And even after they controlled for property crime, they found that officers were typically driving through Black communities more than anyone else. That's after controlling for the crime that they said they were going to fight. And so I would argue that that is disparate impact. Certain communities were getting targeted, were getting over-policed compared to others. The lengthier retention limits, that leads to more plate scans. That can certainly become a real big problem when you commingle all this data at a fusion center like NCRIC. So NCRIC is a partnership. Federal, state, local, and private entities, big infrastructure, universities, they get alerts. They exchange information. This trend started after 9/11. You'll remember, all the federal agencies were fighting each other, saying, you didn't inform us of this, you didn't inform us of that. And so there was a big move to quit siloing all the data, to just take down all the firewalls and share. And, from a police officer's perspective, you could see how that's valuable. As the chief said, crime crosses jurisdictional lines. People move around, people steal cars, so they might not be located in your city anyway. And so you understand that, but the problem at a place like NCRIC, not everybody has the same values. ICE is there, they're located right on the same floor. They have access to the same database. The FBI, there's private parties that aren't subject to the same oversight. And so when you have different values, that commingled nature is a problem. And most local jurisdictions don't ever inform the public of that or talk about how to maybe mitigate that risk. To my understanding, BART is the first and only entity that has ever modified their MOU with NCRIC to firewall their data from federal immigration agencies. I worked with them on that. When the executive director of NCRIC, Mike Senna, came to the Privacy Commission that I chair, I asked him, out of your hundreds and hundreds of partners, I think they have over 350 when you include private parties, has anybody ever, put data restrictions in place? And he said in his 12 years, not one. So you can understand why from a police perspective, it's like, well, yeah, we're not trying to blind other police officers. We need to work together. And I understand that. But from a civil liberties and a privacy perspective, the lack of what I would call mindfulness, not thinking about these other entities that might have different values, it could be a problem. We've seen, there's a couple private vendor products, Forensic Logic and CopLink, which have since merged. It's kind of like a Google search tool, and they partner up with a lot of fusion centers, a lot of federal partners. And we have hundreds of emails from public record requests that the ACLU has obtained showing local police officers running queries for ICE, for deportation specifically. And this is the problem of all these commingled databases that are the trend today. When there are not sufficient guardrails put into place, bad things can happen. Jennifer alluded to the social media stories that they discovered earlier, where the vendor was teaching police how to target Black Lives Matter organizers. And so this is the problem with surveillance. When there is not proper community oversight, there are bad things happening in the shadows. And so our surveillance ordinance models that are, I think there's 19 now across the country, it forces everything out into the open. It's not just the policy writing, but the data, to the extent, obviously lay people should not have access to confidential criminal information, but in the aggregate, the summary of this information must be provided to the public in the annual reporting requirement. And that should work out to the police officers' benefit as well, right? Ideally, and what I've seen in Oakland, and you can imagine, with the police department heading into its 18th year of federal oversight due to racial profiling, we have a lot of distrust, a lot of, there's a rift between a certain part of the community and our police department. And it takes a long time to regain that trust when you've lost it. And one of the ways that they can regain it is not only by putting good policies in place and obviously following them, but demonstrating it. I think police inherently are not transparent. You know, it's just not in their nature. Partly the confidential stuff they got to deal with, should be kept private, but they're generally not going to reveal too much. And that can hurt them, because when good stuff happens, good behavior happens, you need to go out and demonstrate that, so that there is greater police trust in the police. The chief was mentioning earlier about, legitimacy. And I think that's what's, again, been a shining point for Oakland, is that when these annual reports come out and we're at the Privacy Commission, we could talk about them. We look for disparate impact. We look for efficacy. Did we stay within our budget? How much did it cost? That good behavior should lead to increased trust. That's why I became an activist. I was a crazy person that did this as a volunteer for 6 years before I formed Secure Justice. I really wanted to restore trust in our civic institutions, and just being in Oakland, with our police department and the federal monitoring, that was just kind of a heightened concern that I had. And with all the data mining and use of technology nowadays, I just figured that this would be the part where I could have the biggest impact. A couple other things about NCRIC that tie directly to this theme. We didn't talk about suspicious activity reports. These are alerts that also can go out to various agencies. They could be submitted by private parties, not sworn law officers only. A private party can submit this. And we've seen some terrible, terrible, terrible things. Muslim man goes out and buys a pallet of water. Now he's in a database. Angry black man screaming at neighbor. Now he's in a federal database. And who's looking at these databases? ICE, the FBI, other agencies, again, that don't share our same values, might not have the same rules in place. And you get caught in this political machine, where we've had a lot of profiling of Muslims. Now the FBI is Black identity extremists, which apparently means, Black people that are against police violence. We're seeing a lot of profiling occur, and it's getting fed into these commingled databases. And then a lot of those alerts get pushed out to local police officers. And we see harm coming from that when people are mistakenly identified. It's real interesting, Jennifer brought up the Denise Green story, which we always use. I personally used it. The San Francisco Police Officer Association appealed the trial court decision, so we ended up getting binding case law. And little did I know, 10 years later, my brother and I would be getting pulled over by the Contra Costa sheriff's deputies. We had 4 guns pointed at our heads. They pulled us out of the car. We ended up suing. We settled that case. The scanner worked perfectly. And this is my other kind of big problem with this reliance on technology. We think it's infallible. There's you turn a computer on, it always works. Or it can't be racist, it can't be biased. But the problems with relying on it is there are errors. The scan was accurate. It did match the plate. The plate was on a hot list, but the car was not stolen. It was an error. It never should have been put on the hot list. And, I had guns pointed at me. And luckily, no physical harm actually occurred, but it's a pretty terrifying experience. And so when we talk about, the efficacy in all these annual reports, there's a whole lot more information that's needed. When you get 17 arrests, but out of 20 million scans, I don't know, is that effective? Is that something you want to do? At least have the conversation with the community and talk about it. How are you going to ensure the accuracy of data? Just calling dispatch usually isn't going to work. That's actually what happened in Denise Green, because they just look right back at the same DOJ database and it just tells you, yeah, that's the same scan. But if the scan was not supposed to be there in the first place, you didn't actually confirm any accuracy. You're just going to repeat the same mistake. And so there's a whole lot more information that's needed, a whole lot more community engagement that's needed. But if done the right way, which I think like Oakland is doing, I've been consulting with San Diego. They're going to have a Oakland-style privacy commission and surveillance ordinance. These types of civilian oversight models and public engagement are the way to go. It can be done correctly. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. I really appreciate your perspective and really appreciate your work. And especially in terms of how you oversee and engage the community, because I think it can definitely be a model for us in Piedmont as we figure out our own version of that framework. So we are running a little bit short on time, but there is time for some questions. And I think I would like to start by giving Chief Bowers an opportunity to respond to some of the things that Brian brought up. In particular, I think I'm curious, just for my own research about NCRIC, like what our agreement with NCRIC, if there are any protections or what it includes, that would be really interesting to understand, and how we account for, to a certain degree, the need for some of this technology or data to be collected, but at the same time, the inherent or potential invasion of our privacy and impact on disparate impact on people of color.
Yeah, so thank you, and definitely appreciate Brian's perspectives. Definitely adds a lot to the conversation. So as far as the NCRIC goes, and again, I think one of the opportunities that we have here, that we actually talked about was including the executive director in this conversation, so he can speak directly to some of these points. That said, perhaps in the future that's an option. But with respect to the access to the data from the NCRIC, let me just say flat out that during an audit or during any type of information, if we were ever to determine that our data was inappropriately used by the NCRIC, my first action would be to pull our data out of the NCRIC, period. So because of the fact that it's critical that we have that legitimacy and trust that it's going to be appropriately managed. So let me just say that from the outset. What the NCRIC holds themselves accountable to is that individuals, again, who are subject to SB 54, Brian brought up the term ICE, and ICE obviously is a large organization that has different components that work within it. You have, the immigration, you have the enforcement and removal operations component of ICE, which is that component that deals with the removal. But you also have HSI, which is technically under ICE, which is Homeland Security Investigations, that does criminal investigations that has nothing to do with immigration. And so, so that may be what he's referring to in terms of the people who are there who have access. That's not an immigration component. And so the bottom line is that those individuals have no access whatsoever to the data, and that's what the NCRIC tells us, and that's what they're held accountable to. That they hold in terms of the ALPR data or otherwise. The NCRIC holds themselves, they follow the SB 54 to the letter and without exception. And so that's what they hold themselves to. And again, if I, as the chief, and there's a number of chiefs around, we have these discussions that, again, if they were found to not be holding up their end of the bargain, I'm not interested in having my data there because, again, it's not worth the impact to our relationship with our community and how we utilize this. I want to talk a little bit about the in terms of the outreach. It was asked, to expound upon that a little bit more. When we started going down the road of the public safety cameras, actually, I actually referred to the ACLU surveillance impact report, and I found it extremely helpful in our process of engaging with the public on that. And so, obviously, to Brian's point about, just relying on city council to have that public engagement not being sufficient, I couldn't agree more for rolling out a program like, surveillance cameras. And so we did that. We, referred to that report in terms of outlining what we were trying to do. We had a number of community events, information sessions where we articulated what the reason was and what we wanted to do, and invited the public there who did show up. Held a number of community meetings, neighborhood meetings throughout the city, and hired a consultant to put out a widespread survey where we, again, put out information about what we were looking to do in terms of bringing on surveillance, that surveillance technology. And basically, held, again, sent out a survey far and wide to the community to get their input and, to say, hey, this is what we want to do. This is how we want to do it. We've had a pilot. This is the results of the pilot. This is the information. What do you think? And so we got results and responses from that survey, and the community was overall very supportive of it. In addition to that, we partnered with our public safety committee that we have here in the city to do that outreach to the community, and also have opportunities to have discussions about both surveillance's ALPR as well as public safety cameras on an every other month basis. That's a standing public safety committee meeting that we have in the city that affords another opportunity. So, every community is going to decide for themselves how they want to address these issues and what kind of engagement they're going to have, and we're always going to be willing, as the desire evolves, to be willing to be there at the table to have these conversations, because again, I think that's the only way that the only responsible way that we can continue to utilize these types of tools. And again, I think we can get to a yes as long as we are going to be accountable and willing to show up and have those conversations.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to ask a question that is coming from one of our audience members that reflects one that I had as well, which is, are there any examples of communities or surveillance programs that in some way manage for racism and are examples of effective public safety programs? Maybe Matthew, this is something that you can answer for us.
I'd kind of like to hear what Jennifer and Brian have to say, if they've seen any models that they think are more effective. I'll say that in terms of Piedmont, there's not a cookie cutter solution for every place, and Piedmont is, a geographical peculiarity in a way that a solution that works to other places might not work for Piedmont. But I will say that Piedmont is also a public town. It is not a gated community. So if the community gets together and they decide a certain piece of surveillance is right for them to make them feel safe in their town, it cannot be at the expense of people who are going to be victimized just because they drive through a public town. That the community extends beyond just the people who live there to the people who have to commute through the city, the people who work in the city. And so thinking about what model fits for Piedmont needs to go beyond just what makes everybody who lives in the town feel safe, and needs to go to thinking about it in a wider perspective.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because in our work at PADC, our community definition includes not just people who live here, but like you said, people who visit, come here for work, whatever. So thank you. Jennifer, I'd pose the same question to you. Are there examples of communities where these technologies are working, but also issues of racism are addressed?
Yeah, so again, I really think that the best way to manage the racism concerns is to just cease use of surveillance technology altogether. Until that is possible, we do feel that surveillance ordinances that have been passed in several cities are useful to work towards that goal. At minimum, I think that the transparency the oversight and the accountability requirements of those ordinances do keep communities at least informed of what's happening with respect to surveillance, and also provides them with a private right of action to enforce their rights, as we're seeing happen in San Francisco right now. I think that the more folks are armed with information, the more they can fight back against these technologies, take measures to protect themselves and vindicate their rights. But ultimately, I do think that the best way to manage racism concerns is to consider alternatives to surveillance altogether.
I hear you sharing that there technologies like facial recognition software are inherently harmful and shouldn't be used. So Brian, I guess I'm going to give you the last question here, which is really just given your experience in developing programs and understanding that, Piedmont is really in a position right now with Chief Bauer's solicitation of community engagement to develop a framework for ourselves around how these technologies are adopted and deployed. What is your advice? Like, what is the key? What is key to our success here?
I think you've, look at your neighbor, Oakland. You can also look at all the surrounding areas around you. If I can, jump into your previous question a little bit, one way to deal with racism is track race. Oakland is the only entity in the country, and we just amended our ordinance. We're the only ones that are going to be tracking race in the annual reports. How do you measure disparate impact if you don't look at the one most critical factor? So I would encourage people to look at the new Oakland language that'll be online. We just had a vote a little while ago, so it's still not even online yet. I think the Privacy Commission, within the context of the surveillance vetting technology ordinance, is the way to go. It just creates more opportunity for public input, which leads to greater buy-in. It'll hold people more accountable because they're watching, you're being watched. The annual reporting disclosures, will either ideally will demonstrate good behavior and public safety effectiveness, or it's going to say, hey, you need to amend your policies. Like there's disparate impact, or it's just not working. Maybe your retention limits are weird, or there's one or two inappropriate uses. But that's how you have an informed decision. This is good government, and you have to talk to each other. You have to talk to all the stakeholders. You've got to also have data. And that's the part that's been missing in most of these conversations. Some of this technology just doesn't work. If you want to look at a good example, the easiest way to find it, sorry for the self-promo, but there's a secure justice blog post, but you can go look at the BART website as well. Of everybody I work with in the country, I'm holding up BART right now as the gold standard. And for two reasons. Well, number one, just the good faith that they've showed, but the specificity in their annual reports. Your question earlier was, are there anything, programs actually demonstrating success? Yes, they've been very transparent. They provided the information, number of arrests, prosecutions, costs, etc., so that the people can actually see the benefits from using that technology outweigh the negative, potential negative impact. But they also told the truth on other technology. I don't know if you saw, because there was sort of limited trial version, but those big public monitors at some of the BART stations, those were intended to prevent fare jumping. It didn't work at all. It had no impact whatsoever on fare evasion. And so they just bluntly told us that. They said it in the annual report, said this stuff doesn't work, so we're going to stop use. So that's good for the taxpayer. You're not wasting money, but it's also really great for privacy, civil liberties component, that you're no longer, all surveillance technology is going to have some level of invasiveness. It's going to be greater than zero. We might tolerate it, but it's going to be greater than zero. So if you could take that away when it doesn't have any public safety efficacy, is a good decision. It's just good government. And so there definitely are successes out there.
Well, this is the close of our program. Before I hand it over to Susie to bring us to a close, I really just want to thank all of you for taking the time, investing your time to come, to our community and share all this information. It's been really amazing to speak with you all and to leverage in the future, your expertise and what we've learned here tonight. So I really greatly appreciate everything you've shared with us. Thank you.
I just want to say, hey there, everybody. Ditto to what Sheila said, and thank you very much, everybody who participated and all the attendees on the call as well. Nathan, I don't know if you can share, should I share my screen or are you able to share the slide? I want to make sure that I end with a little bit of call to action, what you guys can do next. This is fantastic. This is exactly what PREC and PADC wanted to foster and have happen here, a greater community conversation about policing and public safety and surveillance. What does that mean for our town and the mission of PADC and PREC as we think about how Piedmont can be a more inclusive and diverse community, and also how we can be more anti-racist in the work that we do and how we function as a town in our approach to things like policing and housing and education. So I think it's an incredibly important and salient conversation to have. The surveillance thing also hits PADC directly. You may or may not know, but we got caught up in a NCRIC security alert that went out last spring around the Black Lives protest, time of the Black Lives protest. And in one of those security alerts that goes out from NCRIC, PADC was noted as something of concern to watch out for. So it's we have our own little homegrown case of being caught up in these big databases that's of concern. But if you're interested more in this topic, I really encourage you, just as Chief Bowers said, to show up for city council meetings. Meetings are at 7:30, first and third Mondays. You can also join PREC and PADC. I will be sending the slides out along with the recording to everybody after this call, to all those who RSVP'd, so you can follow up with the information there. Just email us or find us on the web, and we'd love to have you participate and join in some of our meetings and lend your voice to the work that we're trying to do here in Piedmont. So that's it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it very much. And again, to all our panelists, a huge thank you to you for giving us your Thursday evening. Great.